a little bit, and I wasn't sure whether we weren't quite able to make it happen every other few, and that's fine. Just be cognizant of the guys that are serving the Lord's Supper here in a little bit, that they're going to try to make their way through without you having to handle the tray. So the idea is for them, and you're fine, by the way. Those folks that are not, you're good. It's all right. We're fine. The guys that are serving kind of know how to work through that. And so for those who may have come in after I made those opening announcements, the two men that are serving the congregation today will bring the tray to you. The bread is already situated in such a way that you can just pick up a piece, the cup in the same manner, and there'll be an empty tray for your empty cup to put in as they work their way through. And so just be mindful of that as they bring the Lord's Supper to you. Lord willing, next week, by the way, if supplies come in, like I'm hoping they will, we won't need to do this. We've got a different plan in place, Lord willing, moving forward, so long as the supply chain doesn't break down between the warehouse and here. So we probably won't have to do the every other kind of approach, because anyway, I'll explain that one to you next week if it happens. It needs to be. Who likes change? Anybody like change? Raise your hand if you like change. You know, a couple people. We're not real good at change, and when circumstances arise, situations that are kind of extraordinary, right? I mean, we've stopped services on a couple of occasions because of snow or weather-related things, or maybe the building had some kind of maintenance issue or something like that. But I don't know of my lifetime have I ever seen where we actually predetermined that we're canceling services moving forward for an extended period of time. And I appreciate your cooperation as it relates to that. I said in the outset of our announcements this morning, I feel a bit awkward about that. There's a part of me that thinks, well, there are people all across the globe who are in far greater danger than I am today, and they're worshiping God. There are people that live in countries that don't have the freedoms we have. There are folks who put their lives at risk every Sunday to come and worship God, put their livelihoods on the line every Lord's Day to worship God. And then I remind myself, though, but that they have to do that we're in a temporary, hopefully, circumstance, and I don't know that it's apples and apples, because they're in a permanent kind of situation where we're in a temporary situation where we can make some adjustments and still strive to honor God. But at the end of the day, in your mind, at least in mine, you still wonder, am I cheating God? Am I robbing God because we've changed our schedule and we've actually canceled services moving forward? And so I got to thinking about that this week. Gary and I talked the other day and kind of made this decision how we would move forward. I got to thinking about Malachi chapter 3. I got to thinking about the idea of robbing God and how that actually happens. And was that even remotely close to what we were doing by making these changes and even making some cancellations along the way? So if you will, for a few moments, and this could be interesting. Mine's not working, and it's got no power switch. So, but I can do it that way. Now, you talk about, that's, of all the changes today, I promise you that's the hardest for me. To have to reach down and touch this computer to move those slides, I'm going to struggle. Nah, it's okay, Gerald, because you touched it. I don't want to touch it. But anyway, let's talk a little bit about this. In what ways can we rob God? In what real ways can we rob God by our behaviors, choices, and decisions that we may make from time to time? And I want us to go back into this text here in the book of Malachi for just a moment. And I want you to notice what they were doing that actually qualified as robbing God, and maybe get some insight as to how we might do the same. Number one, I want you to recognize from verses 13 to 15 that they had been speaking against God. Notice he says, "Your words have been harsh against me, says the Lord. Yet you say, what have we spoken against you?" So the first thing they did to rob God was they began to think they had power and right to speak against God. They began to think that it was within their authority or ability to be able to actually say things back to God. And God says, you don't have that right. God has the right to speak. Man has the right to listen, the responsibility to listen. God has the right to instruct and to guide and bears all the authority. Man has the responsibility to respond and react to the message of God. And so they had robbed him of his authority. They had robbed him, and they couldn't really, in reality, take it away from him. But their behaviors were acting in such ways that they were denying that authority by even having the audacity to speak against what God had been saying to them. What God had called righteous, they were saying the opposite. What God had said was wicked, they were saying the opposite. And they were speaking against God. They furthered that problem by even going as far as to say that it's vain to serve Him, that there's no real benefit in serving Him. You have said, verse 14, it is useless to serve God. What profit is it we have kept His ordinance and that we have walked as mourners before the Lord of hosts? And so they spoke against the authority and message of God. They even proclaimed that it was worthless and a waste of time, no point or profit in serving Him. There's no value in it. And they even elevated themselves with pride and with wickedness, and even began to tempt God. Verse 15, so now we call the proud blessed, for those who do wickedness are raised up. They even tempt God and go free. They weren't reacting to the wickedness and sinful behaviors among the people. They were elevating the proud and those who would speak out against God. And it's interesting that he says they would hear tempt God and tempt and say things and speak things against God, but would do nothing as related to those folks. My point, friends, is simply this. I think sometimes we have a false concept of what it means to rob God. They were robbing God by their behaviors and choices, denying of His authority, the audacity to speak against Him, the audacity to tempt God. Are you going to strike me dead today, Lord? I'm disobeying your commands and I'm still standing here. That's the way they were robbing God. They were saying all kinds of wickedness and performing all kinds of things out of their own pride and refusing to acknowledge God as they should. And because of that, they were robbing Him of what was rightfully due Him, the respect, the admiration, the praise that was due God. They didn't rob God because they adjusted the circumstances around them. You see, that's where my mind went. When we finally made this choice and decision, and Gary and I talked on the phone, and we finally said this is what the path we're going to take over the next few weeks, and my mind begins to process that, and I got to thinking, okay, am I robbing? Am I denying God? Am I cheating because I'm canceling some services? And then I begin to think, am I really robbing God by adjusting to circumstances that are around me? You've heard me say before, have you ever felt funny when you travel to a location and the congregation that you're worshiping with while you're there doesn't have the same worship schedule that you're used to back home? They meet on a Tuesday instead of a Wednesday. Right? Or maybe they have one prolonged service on a Sunday. And because it's not accustomed or doesn't fit what we traditionally have viewed as a worship day, we get uncomfortable. Friends, I think that we could prove biblically that there were those, including our Savior, who adjusted to the circumstances around them and made choices and decisions that helped and aided the circumstance they were in while still honoring the purposes and will that God had in store for them. Let me prove it to you. In John chapter 7, there's an appeal that's made to Jesus for Him to get busy proving that He is the Son of God. I want you to notice verse 1 of John chapter 7. He said, after these things, Jesus walked in Galilee, for He did not want to walk in Judea because the Jews sought to kill Him. Was Jesus afraid to die? Well, no. Why do we know that? Because He ends up on a cross. That's how we know that. He's willing to stand there in the Garden of Gethsemane and pray to His Father, not my will, but thine be done. And He allows for them to ultimately come and put Him on a cross. Jesus is not afraid to die. What he wants to do is adjust to the circumstances around him because it's not time for him to die yet. It's not time for him yet. And so he purposely, I want you to notice that. He purposely remains in Galilee because he knows if he gets down into Judea, closer to Jerusalem, where the Jews had more power, they would put him to death prematurely. Or at least attempt to. Now the Jews' feast of tabernacle was at hand. His brothers therefore said to him, Depart from here and go into Judea, that your disciples also may see the works that you are doing. For no one does anything in secret while he himself seeks to be known openly. If you do these things, show yourself to the world. For even his brothers did not believe in him. Then Jesus said to them, My time has not yet come, but your time is always ready. Friends, the point Jesus makes, and by the way, he does travel into Judea eventually, but not with the fanfare and not with the efforts and not with the mindset that they had. The point simply is this. Jesus isn't afraid to die. What he is doing is adjusting to the circumstances. Jews already wanted to put him to death. He gets down into Jerusalem too soon. In a certain manner, he could prematurely set off a set of events that the timing wasn't ready yet. And so it's okay to adjust to the circumstances around us. We're not denying God by adjusting to an environment that is changing around us. We haven't robbed him of anything by doing that. Well, did that example hold true for anybody else? Well, go over to Acts chapter 4 with me for a minute. Now, does anybody want to challenge the boldness and the courage of apostles like Peter and John? I don't. I don't want to challenge the boldness and courage of men like Peter and John. They were flawed and had human failures like others, but I'm not going to challenge that. But I want you to notice something with me. Verse 19 of Acts chapter 4. But Peter and John answered and said to them, Whether it is right in the sight of God to listen to you more than to God, you judge. Does that sound like somebody's scared? They look right at him and say, Listen, you decide. Whether we're supposed to honor God or not, you decide, but we're going to honor God. We're going to do the right things. Whether you want us to speak about Jesus or not. For we cannot but speak, verse 20, the things which we have seen and heard. So when they had further threatened them, they let them go, finding no way of punishing them because of the people, since they all glorified God for what had been done. For the man was over 40 years old on whom this miracle of healing had been performed. So they had performed a miracle. They're being challenged because they had done that. They're saying, listen, you want to deny how we've done that through Jesus Christ, but we're going to continue to speak and do the same things. Now I want you to notice verse 23. And being let go, they went to their own companions and reported all that the chief priests and elders had said. What'd they do? Did they stay in that environment and say, we're going to duke it out with these guys until they understand what truth is? No, when they were let go, they got away from that scene for a period of time. They went back to those that were their companions, back to the group of believers that they had been associated with, and they distanced themselves from the problem for a period of time. It's not because they were afraid. It's not because they didn't want to die for Christ. They were adjusting to the circumstance and the environment they were found in. Share another one with you. Acts chapter 12. Acts chapter 12 and verse 12. So when he had considered this, he came to the house. That's not enough, is it? Let me back you up just in case you're not familiar with this text. This is where Peter was in prison. And then the angel comes and wakes him up. Says, time to go. Time to get out. The church had been assembled in various places praying on behalf of Peter that the Lord might strengthen and help him in those circumstances. Okay, now that's where we find ourselves now in verse 12. So when he had considered this, he came to the house of Mary. This is after the angels let him loose. He comes to the house of Mary, the mother of John, whose surname was Mark, where many were gathered together praying. And as Peter knocked at the door of the gate, a girl named Rhoda came to answer. And when she recognized Peter's voice because of her gladness, she did not open the gate, but ran in and announced that Peter stood before the gate. But they said to her, "You are beside yourself," yet she kept insisting that it was so. So they said, "It is his angel." They thought there was no hope for Peter. So much so that they've decided that whatever this is that's outside the gate here knocking at the door has got to be no more than a ghost, because it can't be Peter. He's going to be put to death. I just want you to recognize the magnitude. He feared death. They feared he would die. He's able to get out alive via the help of God and the angel. Where does he go when that occurs? Back to the hotbed of trouble? No, he goes to the house where folks have been praying for him. Now Peter continued knocking, and when they opened the door and saw him, they were astonished. But motioning, verse 17, to them with his hand to keep silent, he declared to them how the Lord had brought him out of the prison. And he said, "Go tell these things to James and to the brethren." And he departed and went to another place. Then as soon as it was day, there was no small stir among the soldiers about what had become of Peter. He was nowhere to be found. In other words, he didn't just go right back into the same situation. And when Herod had searched for him in verse 19 and not found him, he examined the guards and commanded that they should be put to death. He, Peter, went down from Judea to Caesarea and stayed there. Is Peter afraid to die for his Lord? I don't want to say Peter was afraid to die for his Lord. I believe Peter when he said repeatedly, by the way, that he was willing to put his life down on the line. But circumstances dictated that in that particular moment, what should he do? He should get out of Judea and run down to Caesarea, and eventually Herod, next chapter, Herod will die, and some things will change. But Peter goes from prison to safety, and he doesn't stay in the very circumstance that continued to threaten out his life, be a threat to his life. He left that scene and was down into Caesarea. I'm trying to just simply draw a picture for you. Jesus saw that the Jews might try to prematurely put him to death if he went down into Judea openly. And so the time's not ready for that. So the circumstances changed things. He didn't do what his brethren asked him to do. Peter and John were bold when they spoke the truth, but when they were set free, they didn't go right back to the same set of problems. They actually go back to where their companions, those that they could entrust, and those that would help and aid them. When Peter is freed from prison, the circumstances change. He doesn't run right back out and start causing the same kinds of issues that it got him into prison to begin with. He actually flees that area and goes down to Caesarea. We could look at the Apostle Paul being let out of what? Let out of over that wall in that basket? Why? Because Paul was afraid to die for the Lord? No, the circumstances changed. Paul made adjustments to continue to serve and do the work of his Creator. Friends, the simple point is sometimes you got to make adjustments. Sometimes change, which we're resistant to. But sometimes circumstances dictate that some change is necessary. And we have to at times do things differently than we're accustomed to. And that we help set a mindset within us that doesn't automatically jump to the idea that we're robbing God because we made adjustments due to circumstances that we were in. It doesn't automatically equate to that. Go back to Malachi 3 in your mind for a moment. What had they actually done? What was it where they were actually being accused of robbing God? It was their choices and behaviors as it related to, would they listen to His authority? Would they behave in righteous ways? Were they honoring wickedness rather than righteousness? Were they speaking out in favor of those who were tempting God? That's what caused them to rob God. Not because they were making some adjustments. And maybe that mindset stems from a oversimplified definition of what faithfulness means. May I suggest to you that we have oversimplified what qualifies as faithfulness in this. If you come to church, that's our definition. Now, you may say, no, it's not, Brian, but it is. That's what it's become. And the more worship services you go to, the more faithful you are. You say, well, how do you draw that conclusion? Well, I draw that conclusion because think about the people that you know that go to a lot of services. And I'm not talking about just their regular services, but people that you know that no matter where the gospel meeting is, they're always there, they're always in attendance, and what do we say? We are saying they are so faithful. And in an odd kind of way, we have created in our minds a thought process that says faithfulness equals attendance. Now, I'm not saying we subscribe to it in some kind of authoritative way, but subconsciously, that's the way we've defined it. In fact, sometimes it's the only thing we react to. There could be all kinds of other activities, behaviors, choices that would be qualified as being unfaithful to God, and we say nothing. So long as they're faithful in attendance. And that's an oversimplified definition of what it means to be faithful. Collective worship's essential. When Gary and I talked the other day, it was one of the things that we very expressly spoke about. Was we felt like as long as we could and as best as we could. And under the present circumstances, I don't know what the next week or two is going to bring, by the way. We can speculate all day long why we haven't had a case here in West Virginia. I got my theories. Nobody comes here. And nobody can afford to leave. That's as good as any, by the way. But I don't know what the next few weeks are going to hold. But I'm hoping that we can at least do this on the Lord's Day. Yeah, we might have to adjust to the circumstance, not hold so many, limit the exposures. You might wonder, why didn't we do Bible class? The reason we didn't do Bible class is children tend to be asymptomatic. So when they're getting this, they may go walk around and you may not even know they have it. But they're carrying it to the 60 and 70 and 80-year-olds. It used to be Grandma would say, right? You know, Grandma would say, I'm not feel good. Don't give Grandma a hug today. Well, it's got to be vice versa now. You got to reverse that. And so that's why we didn't do Bible classes, because that would create a greater sense of exposure, potentially. So we make adjustments. And we recognize the circumstance we're in, but we still honor the Lord's Day. Because collective worship is essential. You know the text as well as I do. Hebrews chapter 10, verse 24. Let us consider one another in order to stir up love and good works, not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together. By the way, that's a collective effort. We sometimes look at this passage as an individual measure. It's not. I don't think he's talking individual. I get it. You can't have a collective effort if the individuals don't show up. I get that. But he didn't say, he wasn't speaking to the individual about don't miss an assembly. He's talking to the body saying don't forget to assemble. Don't forsake assembling as the collective body. I debated, I can't see that clock anymore. I debated in my mind whether because I wanted to explore a little bit maybe with Hebrews 10. Maybe I'll do that some other time. But if you look at all of Hebrews 10, the early part of Hebrews 10 is talking about the Old Testament. It talks about their sacrifices and the things that they were doing. And in some ways, their mindset of the more sacrifices we offer, the better we are in relationship to God. And He dispels that. In fact, He reminds them of some narratives where He said, God says, I don't even want any more sacrifices. If you're going to bring them to me without the heart and mind that's necessary. And so maybe the New Testament Christians were tempted to think, well, then God doesn't want us to assemble anymore because of the failures of those under the Old Testament law. And then He says, no, that's not what I'm saying. I still want you to assemble. Don't forsake assembling. And so those circumstances might dictate that we limit those. Those circumstances might change the way we think about how often we assemble. In the moments, we're still striving to honor. That's what they did in Acts chapter 20 and verse 7. They came together on the Lord's day, upon the first day of the week, to break bread. Collect is essential. And so we can do everything we can to limit. We'll space out. We'll not touch trays. We'll wash doorknobs. We'll do everything we can. But still strive as best we can to assemble so long as we can. Extraordinary circumstances. Because genuinely, folks, faithfulness is unseen. My faithfulness to God isn't just about whether or not I assemble. I've already illustrated Hebrews 10, Acts 20, the necessity of assembling. So I'm not saying you don't need to come to assembly. What I'm saying is it's not the end-all answer to whether I'm faithful to God or not. It's not the only thing that needs to be valued and viewed and looked at. In fact, verse 6 of Proverbs 20, he says, most men will proclaim each his own goodness. I was at church here, right? As if we were calling off roll. I was here, I'm here. Most men will proclaim each his own goodness. But who can find a faithful man? You're not going to find a faithful man just by going around asking, who's here? Faithfulness is revealed in much more important matters than that. Let me rephrase that. I'll get in trouble for that phrase. I don't want to create a hierarchy. There's more to it than just saying I'm present. Faithfulness is more than just being in an assembly. Faithfulness is defined as to how I treat my family and how I deal with my neighbors and what kind of worker I am at the job and how it is I conduct my personal life, my personal behaviors and choices, and the righteousness that I strive for. And do I avoid the things that God has said is wicked? All of those things that may not ever really be seen by anybody are really going to be at the heart of what defines me as to whether I am faithful or not. And so in one sense, I'm trying to maybe I'm on a path that I don't need to go on with you. I don't know. But I'm trying to put you at ease. It's okay that we've made some adjustments, circumstances dictated. We're trying to do the best we can to cooperate with government entities and how they're trying to suggest we avoid a greater catastrophe and all. We're doing our best to cooperate with all of that in the circumstance. That means limiting how many times we come into this building. And it's okay that for a few weeks we only come in here once a week. It's okay. We haven't robbed God by doing that. We're not cheating Him. In fact, if our mindset goes to the idea that the only way you can really prove yourself to God is to have more services, then I'm doing exactly what they did under the Old Testament law that God says He didn't even want anymore. And so I'm trying to maybe in some senses put our minds at ease about what we're doing over the next couple of weeks. But also then in the same breath challenge us to realize, am I really faithful? Have I oversimplified faithfulness so much that all I ever think about really is, am I attending services? Because there's a whole host of other things that are vital to evidencing my faithfulness to God. And it is absolutely possible for Brian Price to show up in this building every time his doors are open and still be unfaithful to God. It's an absolute possibility. Because assembling is not the end-all only answer to what makes me faithful. How I live daily determines my level of faithfulness. Not just what I do on Sundays, or not just what I do on the occasions where we have collective assemblies. But what I do daily. Verse 42 of Matthew 24. Watch therefore, for you do not know what hour your Lord is coming. But know this, that if the master of the house had known what hour the thief would come, he would have watched and not allowed his house to be broken into. Therefore you also be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour you do not expect. Are you hoping the Lord comes back while you're sitting in these pews? Because then He would find me faithful. Isn't it interesting what Jesus said about His coming? He says, I want you to be ready all the time. Whether you're sitting in a pew, or whether you're in the grocery store, or you're at work, or you're at home, or wherever you might find yourself, faithfulness is a daily routine. And it doesn't rise and fall with the worship assemblies. My faithfulness should be level with what God desires from me at all times. Be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour you do not expect. Verse 45, who then is a faithful and wise servant, whom his master made ruler over his household to give them food in due season? Blessed is that servant whom his master, when he comes, will find so doing. When Jesus returns, He wants to find you and I doing what citizens of His kingdom are supposed to be about. And you and I actively involved in honoring and serving Him. That's what He wants. Assuredly, I say to you that He will make him ruler over all His goods. In the parable that He's drawing here. Let your faithfulness be daily. And yes, we're going to feel a little odd not coming back here tonight. I hope so in some ways, right? I hope so in some ways. Or not coming back on Wednesday night or doing something different. I see you here in a few minutes, you're going to want to reach out and take that tray out of their hands. I promise you, you will. You're going to fight. You're going to have to resist the temptation. Because we are so accustomed to tradition and custom and pattern. When we start breaking those, I'm not being political with what I'm about to say, but I'm going to say it. It's going to sound political, but it's not. I watched yesterday a press conference. You saw maybe the one with the president had the hat on. Anyway, there was a reporter pounding him because the day before she witnessed him shake hands with somebody. And love him, don't like him, whatever, disagree with his politics, whatever, it doesn't matter. Here's the point that he said, I thought spoke volumes. He said, it's hard not to. Somebody reaches their hand out to you in all your life. What do you do when somebody reaches their hand out to you? You shake it. We're all going to have things that are going to be hard to break, was the point he was making. I thought it was really hypercritical. Find something there. I'm sure there's something legitimate you might want to ask about. But whether or not somebody shook somebody's hand or not, it's going to be hard. I like the songs Bill picked today. I don't know whether, I'm sure you thought it out. I can tell. Sherry picked them. All right. Sherry picked them for you. But they were well thought out, Sherry. Good for you. Right? My prayer is not another person will be infected. My prayer would be, if there are more, that the affliction be light. I pray for no more loss of life. And I pray that God strengthen and help us and keep us faithful to Him in our daily walk. Despite the fact that we might have to break a few customs and traditions and things we used to do and things that kind of feel comfortable to us and things that we may be overly defined as being religious and all those kinds of things. And we have to kind of get past some of that and start just focusing on what it really means to be faithful to God. I don't know how. I never prescribe. Try not to say when God's involved, when God's not involved, what God's doing, what He's not doing. It's not our place, right? It's not our place. But there's lessons to be learned and things that we can refocus on, reminders that I hope will encourage all of us to be faithful. And if worst case scenarios begin to happen, my prayer is our world will find the Creator while the opportunity is available. And that we could face uncertain days with strength and courage and hope. We sing all the time, this world is not my home, I'm just a passing through. My treasures are laid up somewhere beyond the blue. The angels beckon me. Let's just be faithful. Jesus returns, be faithful. Catastrophe hits, be faithful. Darkness strikes, be faithful. And by all means, don't panic. Jesus said, you believe in God, believe also in me. We face things with great strength and courage because we have a refuge known as God. And so, I pray that we all remain steadfast and faithful, even as circumstances change our routine in our service to Him. If you're subject to the gospel in some way, there's still power in the blood of Jesus. There's power in the message that provides salvation, hope through the gospel. I'd encourage you to think soberly about your relationship with God. Are you ready? Am I being faithful? Am I striving to honor Him daily? Without oversimplifying that, without looking at it as simply a custom or a tradition. But am I being faithful to Him? And if we can encourage you in your response to the gospel even this morning, won't you come while we stand and as we sing? Would you be free from your burden of sin? Power in the Lord. Power in the Lord. Would you, Lord, claim all victory with their